There is a Chinese car parked outside the headquarters of Ford in Michigan. The head of the company drives it every single day. He did not buy it from a dealer. He had his team find some of the best electric cars coming out of China, ship them across the ocean, and take them apart piece by piece. He has called the experience one of the most humbling things he has seen in his career. Ford is not the only company doing this. Volkswagen is doing similar work. Other manufacturers are studying the same vehicles quietly. Across the West, the companies that once expected to lead the electric transition have started examining the homework of a rival that grew up in They are looking at its batteries, its factories, and its way of putting cars together. If you enjoy videos like this, please hit the like button. These take real effort to research and produce. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. What you are about to hear is not only a story about cars, it is a story about how the way the world builds complex products is shifting in real time. Decisions being made in boardrooms in Detroit and Wolfsburg will influence the vehicles on the road for decades. To understand why so many Western automakers are studying BYD and other Chinese makers so closely, you first need to see what happened when they opened those cars up. The head of Ford did something unusual for a leader of a century-old company. He instructed teams to bring competitive Chinese electric vehicles to the United States. They were shipped across the ocean, taken to Michigan, and carefully disassembled in a laboratory setting. One of the cars that stood out was the Xiaomi SU7, the first vehicle from a Chinese smartphone company that had entered the car business. Farley has driven one for an extended period and has spoken openly about how revealing the experience was. He has also tested Chinese electric pickups and compared them with vehicles from his own lineup and from Toyota. The cost structure and engineering choices were hard to reconcile with the prices Western factories were achieving. When the engineers finished the teardowns, the conclusions were uncomfortable. Farley has said publicly that the findings were shocking and that the gap in tools, software, architecture, and manufacturing systems was large. One outside expert who examined Ford's situation reportedly told leadership that competing with a fully integrated player like BYD using traditional approaches would be extremely difficult. Once the leader of a major legacy automaker states that the company is years behind in key areas, the conversation inside the industry changes. The fastest way many companies see to close the gap is not to invent everything from scratch. It is to study what the leaders in cost and integration are already doing and adapt the useful parts. Ford is not alone. Volkswagen and other European groups are examining the same lessons. They are looking at a company that only began serious passenger car production in the early 2000s, and that grew from a background in rechargeable batteries rather than a century of combustion engine tradition. The question is, what exactly is being studied, and why it is proving hard to replicate quickly? The answer starts with the most expensive single component in an electric car and reaches all the way back to raw materials in the ground. In a modern electric vehicle, the battery pack can represent roughly 40% of the total cost. Whoever controls cost and performance at that level holds a major advantage. For years, many Western car companies treated batteries as something to purchase from specialist suppliers. They paid the market price and focused on the rest of the vehicle. BYD took a different path early. It developed its own lithium iron phosphate chemistry and a structural approach known as the blade battery. The cells are long and thin and can be arranged to form part of the vehicle structure itself. By moving towards cell 2-pack designs, the company reduces intermediate modules, saves space, lowers weight, and cuts cost. Critically, BYD manufactures the cells rather than buying them. The knowledge stays inside the company and feeds directly into its own vehicles. The integration goes further. BYD has invested upstream in lithium resources in places such as Chile and parts of Africa so that more of the material chain is under its influence. From the mineral in the ground to the finished car, the company tries to own or control as many steps as practical. Western manufacturers are now attempting versions of the same moves. Ford has built a battery plant in Michigan that produces lithium iron phosphate cells. The technology path involved licensing and technical support from a major Chinese battery maker, even while Ford retains ownership of the facility. Leadership has spoken about learning from the cost and supply chain approaches that Chinese companies demonstrated in Europe. Volkswagen and related brands are pushing harder for in-house battery and drivetrain capability and are evaluating lower-cost chemistries and more integrated pack designs. The three ideas that BYD proved at scaloning the cell using simpler structural packs and controlling more of the upstream material are now appearing in the plans of large Western groups. It is easy to underestimate a battery because it looks like a sealed box of chemistry. In reality, it is the first domino. Once a company owns the cell, it begins asking why it should not also own the pack assembly, the electric motors, the power electronics, and eventually more of the software and semiconductors. The battery is not just one component it is the entry point into copying a broader system. BYD began as a battery company in the 1990s making cells for mobile phones. When it moved into cars, it already understood high-volume, low-cost battery manufacturing. Western automakers are trying to compress decades of that learning into a few years of heavy investment. The battery plant is the visible part. The harder part is the surrounding culture of continuous cost reduction and system-level design. The deeper practice that the industry is trying to imitate is vertical integration itself. BYD does not only make the battery, it designs and produces many of its own motors, power, electronics, and even some of the computing chips that run the vehicle. In an industry where most players buy specialized components from a web of suppliers, this level of ownership is unusual. One executive has described the challenge as no longer competing against a single car, but against an entire integrated system that runs from raw materials to the finished product. For roughly 40 years, the dominant Western industrial model ran in the opposite direction. Specialization was considered smart. A company made the parts it was best at and bought everything else from whoever could supply it more efficiently. Automakers stopped making their own steel. They outsourced electronics, software, semiconductors, and eventually battery cells. The system was lean and, for a long time, effective. It rested on a quiet assumption. The things you do not own will remain available at predictable prices when you need them. Recent years broke that assumption. The semiconductor shortage of the early 2020s stopped production lines. Shipping costs spiked. Tariffs and geopolitical friction added further uncertainty. Suddenly, the companies that controlled more of their own supply looked better prepared. Watch the reversal. Ford is building a new low-cost electric effort centered on a clean sheet platform and greater ownership of the vehicle software so that sensors and computers can be used more efficiently and updates can be delivered over the air. That approach is closer to the habits of software-driven Chinese makers than to traditional Detroit practice. Volkswagen has been told by its own leadership that future competitiveness depends on bringing more battery and drivetrain production in-house rather than relying solely on external suppliers. Across the industry, 40 years of outsourcing is being partially walked back. The companies are doing it because a player that grew up with a different logic demonstrated that the old rules no longer protected cost and supply security in the same way. Yet there are limits to how quickly the change can happen. You can study a battery and build a plant. You can decide to own more of the software stack. What is harder to acquire is 20 years of designing the whole system together from the cell outward. BYD's car business grew on top of an existing battery business. The integration was not added later as an afterthought. It was the foundation. Legacy companies are attempting to graft similar integration onto organizations with a century of different habits, supplier relationships, and cost structures. History shows that total vertical control has both strengths and risks. Henry Ford once tried to own the entire chain, including rubber plantations in the Amazon. That experiment failed. Full control looks attractive during shortages and can become a burden when markets are calm and specialized suppliers are efficient. The current shift is a response to a world that feels less predictable than the one in which the outsourcing model thrived. Another less visible practice being studied is platform discipline. BYD learned to build many different models on a smaller number of shared platforms and component sets. The same motors, battery formats, and electronic modules appear across multiple vehicles. The approach sounds unexciting. It is one of the main reasons high volume can be profitable. Analysts note that companies selling large numbers of vehicles from a limited set of platforms achieve better margins. For a traditional manufacturer, this often means painful decisions, fewer unique models, more shared parts, and a willingness to cancel vehicles that no longer fit the simplified architecture. Ford has announced a multi-billion-dollar investment in a new universal electric platform intended to underpin a family of more affordable vehicles. Beginning with a midsize electric pickup targeted at a relatively low starting price and built in the United States. The company has staffed a dedicated engineering center with people experienced in electric vehicles and cost reduction. and it has publicly linked the effort to the competitive pressure coming from Chinese makers. In Europe, Volkswagen is in the middle of a large restructuring aimed at billions in annual savings, including significant workforce reductions in Germany. The cost of adapting is measured in cancelled models, closed capacity, and difficult labor negotiations. Copying the results of a low-cost integrated system is not a slide in a strategy presentation. It is an expensive transformation. Western executives often hold two ideas at once. On one side, they express respect for the manufacturing and cost performance of the leading Chinese companies. On the other, they describe those same companies as a competitive threat. Chinese-built electric vehicles face high tariffs in the United States, which limits direct sales. The language used in public, therefore, tends to be careful, learning from, studying, adapting best practices. The practical activity is the same. Teams open the cars, measure the wiring, count the fasteners, examine the battery structure, and try to achieve similar cost and integration in their own products. The cost-cutting culture is part of daily life at companies that grew up under intense domestic competition in China. Every part is questioned. Western companies that once competed mainly on brand features and premium pricing are discovering that large numbers of buyers simply want a good car at a lower price. The ability to deliver that combination is becoming decisive. When studying and reverse engineering prove too slow, another option appears: bring the Chinese product or partner directly into Western factories. Stellantis, the group that owns Jeep, Fiat, Ram, and other brands, took a stake in the Chinese electric vehicle maker Leapmotor and has arranged production of Leapmotor models on European lines, including facilities in Spain. In Barcelona, a plant once associated with Nissan is now linked to Chery production. Chinese brands have grown from a tiny share of the European market a few years ago to a meaningful percentage by 2026. BYD itself has opened a large plant in Hungary and has explored additional sites. Chinese manufacturing is no longer only an ocean away. It is being established inside Europe. Even Ford has been the subject of rumors about possible cooperation with Chinese partners. Although both sides have denied formal joint venture plans, the spectrum of responses is now complete. At one end, companies tear vehicles apart in laboratories to understand the recipe. At the other end, they simply manufacture the Chinese-designed vehicle on their own soil under commercial agreements. Step back from any single company and a larger pattern becomes visible. For 4 decades, the West largely won by specializing. Make what you do best, buy the rest, and trust that the rest will remain cheap and available. That operating system worked so well that it stopped looking like a choice. The activity described in this video is the sound of that operating system being revised. Piece by piece, major Western automakers are moving back toward greater control of the chain, from materials and cells to software and final assembly. The shift is not a minor adjustment. It is an admission that the previous rules no longer provide the same protection. The company that demonstrated a different set of rules at scale sits in. That is one reason the language around the change remains careful. Openly declaring that a Chinese battery-on-car company has become the reference point would be uncomfortable for organizations that spent a century defining the industry. The evidence, however, is visible in the factories being built, the platforms being redesigned, and the cost targets being set. The engineers are changing how they design. The factories are changing how they source and assemble. The leadership teams are changing how they talk about competition. Much of the movement can be traced to the moment Western companies looked closely at vehicles that combined low cost, high integration, and rapid iteration, and realized the old playbook was no longer sufficient. One company wrote a different set of rules and scaled them. Others are now studying those rules under pressure. If you found this examination of the shifting auto industry useful, hit the like button and subscribe so you catch the next deep dive. Turn on notifications if you want to be first to see new videos. Related videos are on the screen if you want to keep watching. Here is a question for the comments. Do you think studying and adapting the approaches pioneered by BYD is the smartest path for Western automakers? Or is it already too late to close the gap? Let me know what you think.